Parshas Balak. Parshas Balak begins with a setup of what's bothering Balak. What's bothering Balak is Vayar Balak ben Tzipor, Eis kol asher asa Yisrael lo Emori. Balak, the son of Tzipor, saw everything that Israel had done to the Emori, to the Amorites. So Rashi explains that Balak said, Sichon and Og, on who we relied, they got destroyed. They couldn't resist the children of Israel. So how can we? So we've got to try something new. And the next verse describes the impact of the Bnei Israel, of the children of Israel, on the Moabites. It says, Vayogar Moab mipnei ha'am ma'od kiravhu. Moab was very afraid of the people because they were many. A lot of Jews, scary, especially because they had come off of a military victory. Vayakotz, this continuing that verse, this is Pasuk Gimel. Vayakotz Moab mipnei bnei Israel. And Moab was, we're going to talk about what Vayakotz means, but just straight up, it means disgusted. They were disgusted because of Bnei Israel. Some translated distressed, others fearful, but the language of Katzti b'chayai, I'm disgusted, I'm finished. So first of all, what is the difference between Vayagar and Vayakotz? The first part of the pasuk says, Vayagar Moab mipnei ha'am ma'od kiravhu. They were very fearful. Vayagar is like lo saguru mipnei ish. Don't be afraid. Don't capitulate because of your fear to anybody. This is specifically an adjuration to judges that they shouldn't fear the blowback from a ruling. But here we see that the people, Moab, was very fearful of the Israelites. But it refers to them as ha'am. They're just kiravhu. They're just massive. There's so many of them. Or they're very strong, one or the other, or both. But what's the difference between being afraid, Vayagar, and Vayakotz Moab mipnei bnei Israel? And Moab was disgusted by the children of Israel. So let's first look at Rashi. Rashi says that Vayagar is Lashon Mora, that Vayagar means that they were afraid, and Vayakotz means Kotzu b'chayayim. They were sick of their lives. They're disgusted by their lives, meaning the Moabites. Now, there's a similar phrase in the beginning of Shemos, which describes the response of the Egyptians to the children of Israel. And there it says, Vayakutsu mipnei bnei Israel. This is in the very first chapter of Shemos, 1:12, Aleph Yud Beis. It says, Vayakutsu mipnei bnei Israel. That they were disgusted. But there Rashi says, Na'asu kakotzim be'enehem. The Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, became like thorns in their eyes. And here Rashi says something else. He says, Kotzu b'chayayim, they were sick of their lives. So Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrachi picks up on this, and he asks the question, why does Rashi give two different explanations? One of them, they were disgusted with their lives. The other one is that the Jews were like thorns in the eyes of the Moabites. So the Gur Aryeh explains that to be like thorns in their sides, in their eyes, is only if somebody is threatening you or causing you distress. But so that applies here because the Moabites felt threatened, but the Egyptians weren't really threatened. They weren't under subject to fear of the Bnei Israel. So Rashi explains somewhat differently. There he says that they were disgusted with their lives. Why that would be is a separate question. Gur Aryeh doesn't go into it completely. But if we look at the explanation of the Netziv says, and the Malbim echoes this, the Malbim says that the Moabites viewed the Jews as a separate people. Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, earlier in the verse it refers to Ha'am, now it refers to Bnei Yisrael, that this talks about their greatness, that they were separated, muvdalim badas miuchedes, ubagoyim lo yischashav, that they had their own separate religion and they really weren't part of the community of peoples. And, says the Malbim, the ein sina k'sines hadas. There's no hatred that's quite as intense as the hatred of religion. So the Malbim kind of explains that we're talking about a culture war or a resentment of a different religion because of a separation, an isolation, perhaps an insulation, that the Bnei Israel were separate from the Moavites. The Moavites couldn't stand that, and they were therefore contemptuous, which is Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's translation of Vayakatz. Now the Netziv actually gives a somewhat related but somewhat different explanation. And he says that the Vayakutsu Mipnei Bnei Israel of Shemos concerning the Mitzrim and Vayakatz Mipnei Bnei Israel over here are one and the same. And that is that the reference to Bnei Yisrael, to the children of Israel, means that which is distinctive. It's not just ha'am, a people, kiravhu, that is very large. Any large people can be very large. But Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, are distinctive. They have a distinctive culture. And their culture is that the Gedolei Yisrael, the leaders or the heroes of Israel, generally speaking, are pretty good people. He says, Shelo yir'u mehem sheyasu ra'ah. The Moavites did not see that these Bnei Yisrael were acting badly. They weren't bad people. They're good people. And normally, leaders are corrupt. And here he says, Ki ein derech adam gadol b'kach. It's not typical for a person who has achieved greatness to not cut corners and to not abuse his power. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He says, Aval hisbonenu b'gadlusam. The Moavites contemplated the greatness of the Jews. And when they compared themselves, they said, we're like thorns. We're like worthless pieces of vegetation. They saw that these people, either the Jews generally or the great ones among the Jews, conducted themselves in a much more refined way. And so they despised the people who conducted themselves, who held themselves in practice to a higher standard. Now, this is a direct result of a comparison of the Moavites comparing themselves to the Israelites, and they saw the greatness of the Israelites, and they felt puny by comparison. Now, there are two ways to view somebody who has attributes that you don't have or has achieved things that you don't have. You can either admire them, perhaps from a distance, or you can emulate them. You can admire and attempt to emulate them. Or you can look at them, and because of their greatness and because of the feeling of smallness that seeing someone else's greatness generates, you can have contempt for them because you don't want to look small. Rabbi Noach Weinberg used to say, Lashon Hara is a shortcut to greatness, we think. If you are a small tree in a forest, and there are lots of other forests around, lots of other trees around, and they're taller than you are. So you can approach that disparity in one of two ways. You can either grow yourself so that you are as tall or getting taller, and you can approach their size, or you can chop all the other trees down. And he said that's the psychology behind Lashon Hara, behind speaking ill of others, is that we deceive ourselves into thinking that we become great by comparison if we can bring others down. The Torah's approach to accomplishments of others is cited in the first verse of Shema. Should love the Lord your God with all your heart, which may mean mind, according to Rabbi Victor Miller. We've said this on numerous occasions. And Rashi says, B'shnei yitzrecha. It could have said libcha, lamed beis chaf. It says instead, b'chol levavcha, with two letters beis, two osios beis. They represent a duality. And that duality is, yes, it's true we compare ourselves to others. And when we compare ourselves to others, we could either wish ill on others, or we can use others to inspire us to achieve greatness. And this is taking the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara and serving Hashem with both. The Yetzer Hara, in this case, is comparing myself to somebody else, noticing the difference, understanding that I'm not as great or as accomplished as he is, and setting out to be accomplished and to be great. We can either be like Balak and seek to bring down others who have greatness, or we can be, as the Torah asks us to be, we can look at the difference and we can say, I too want to achieve greatness, and I will do it by growing myself to new heights and to new accomplishments. Have a good Shabbos.